The wind came first, before the wagon even crested the ridge, cutting through Wren Aldred's thin coat like it meant to strip the flesh from her bones. Montana, in late autumn, did not welcome strangers. It tolerated them barely, and only if they kept moving. Wren sat rigid on the bench seat beside a driver who had not spoken 10 words to her since Cheyenne, her hands folded in her lap like a woman praying. Though she had stopped believing prayers were answered somewhere around the time her father's coffin went into the ground. 3 months, that was how long it had taken her stepmother, Ada Pruitt, to decide that a grown stepdaughter, with no dowry and no prospects, was a debt rather than a duty. 3 months to sell the house, the furniture, the good china that had belonged to Wren's mother, and to still come up short against the man in Helena who held the paper on Ada's late husband's gambling debts. And when the numbers still did not add up, Ada had looked at Wren the way a woman looks at a piece of furniture she is tired of dusting. "There is a man out past the Bitterroot Crossing," Ada had said, not even looking up from her needlework. "He owes nothing to no one and wants for nothing either, which means he will not come looking for what is his once it is done. $1, Wren. That is what it took." $1 and my signature on a paper. Neither of us read closely because neither of us expected the man taking the paper to be anything but a drifter passing through, a man with dust on his boots and no roof of his own, someone Ada assumed would vanish into the frontier, taking the inconvenience of her stepdaughter with him. Wren had not cried when she signed her name beneath her stepmother's on that paper. She had already run out of tears sometime in the spring, when the grief for her father had curdled into something harder, something that sat in her chest like a stone she carried everywhere. She only asked, in a voice she did not recognize as her own, whether the man was cruel. Ada had shrugged. "I neither know nor care," she'd said. "He paid. That is all that signifies." So Wren had gone, because there was no version of staying that did not end worse. She had packed one trunk with her mother's shawl, a Bible with a broken spine, and a photograph of her father in his Sunday coat, and she had climbed onto a wagon bound for a ranch she had never seen, to be handed over to a man she had never met, for the price of a single silver dollar. She told herself, over and over on that long, cold ride, that whatever waited for her at the end of it could not possibly be worse than the last 3 months. She told herself this the way a person recites scripture they no longer fully believe, because the alternative was to stop breathing altogether. The wagon crested the ridge, and the driver reined in the horses, and Wren's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. Below them the land opened into a valley so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Cattle moved across it in dark, unhurried rivers. Fences ran for miles, mended and true, not the sagging, half-hearted lines she had expected from a poor man's holding. A house stood at the valley's heart, and it was not a shack, not a soddy, not the crude cabin of a man with nothing to his name. It was 2 stories of timber and stone, smoke rising steady from not one chimney but 2, with a barn beside it larger than any church Wren had ever set foot in. She turned to the driver, certain there had been some mistake. He only spat over the side of the wagon and said, "That's Colton land, all of it clean to the mountains. Man you're looking for owns near half this valley." Wren's stomach dropped as though the wagon itself had gone over a cliff edge. She thought of her stepmother's careless words, a drifter, a penniless man passing through. She thought of the dollar changing hands and felt suddenly, sickeningly, that she understood none of what had actually happened, that she had been delivered into something far larger and more dangerous than a poor man's bargain. The wagon rattled down into the yard, and a man stepped out from the barn's shadow, wiping his hands on a rag. And Wren's first thought was that he did not look like a man who owned half a county. He wore a plain work shirt gone soft with washing, trousers patched at the knee, despite what must have been considerable means to replace them, and there was dust on him same as any hand. But his eyes, when they found her, were sharp and assessing in a way that made her sit up straighter, despite the exhaustion dragging at every limb. His name was Ezra Colton, though she would not learn that until later. What she noticed first was how he stopped walking when he got close enough to see her properly, close enough to see the thinness of her wrists where her sleeves had ridden up, the bruised dark shadows beneath her eyes, the way she flinched when the wagon driver climbed down heavy behind her. Something moved across his face that Wren could not name yet, though she would come to know it well, In the months ahead, it was not confusion, though there was some of that. It was not desire, though men had looked at her before with that particular hunger, and she knew the shape of it. What crossed Ezra Colton's face standing in his own dooryard with the wind picking up loose strands of her hair was something closer to fury, cold and immediate, and it took her a long moment to understand that fury was not aimed at her at all. He looked at the driver. "What in God's name is this?" he said, and his voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse, made it carry further across the yard than shouting would have. The driver shrugged, already turning back toward the wagon, like a man eager to be done with an unpleasant errand. "Papers in the satchel, mister. Woman said you paid for her already. $1, and the debt's settled." "That's what she told me to tell you." Wren watched Ezra's jaw tighten, watched a muscle jump there once, twice, and she found herself bracing without meaning to. The old instinct from 3 months of living under Ada's roof, the instinct that said a man's anger always eventually finds its way to you, no matter whose fault it truly is. But he did not turn that fury on her. He turned it on the empty air where the wagon driver had already begun climbing back up onto his bench, already flicking the reins, already leaving her stranded in a stranger's yard with a trunk containing everything she owned in the world. Ezra took 2 steps after the wagon hand, half raised as though to call the man back, to demand answers, to undo whatever had been done. But the wagon was already rolling, and Wren understood with a sinking clarity that there would be no answers coming from that direction. Not today. He turned back to her then, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The wind moved between them, worrying at the hem of her skirt, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked twice and went quiet. Wren felt the full weight of her own filth, and exhaustion. 3 days of hard travel pressed into her skin and her hair and the set of her shoulders, and she felt something else too, something she had not expected to feel, standing in the yard of the man who had apparently paid $1 to own her. She felt seen, not in the way men usually saw women, appraising and proprietary. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a wound, trying to understand how deep it runs, before deciding how to treat it. "I don't know what you were told," Ezra said finally, and his voice had gone rough at the edges. "But whatever it was, I expect it was a lie, because I sent no dollar for any woman. I don't buy people. Never have, never will." Wren's mouth had gone dry. "Then why?" she managed. "Why did the paper say what it said? Why did she tell me your name?" "Because I paid off her husband's debts 6 months back," he said. "A business matter, nothing more. A loan between men who used to be friends before whiskey and cards ruined the friendship. I forgave what was owed him when he died, because chasing a dead man's widow for money felt like a cruelty I wasn't willing to commit. I never asked for repayment. I never wanted repayment. And I sure as hell never asked for a person delivered to my door like livestock at auction." Wren felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been held rigid and controlled since the morning Ada told her what had been arranged. It was not relief exactly. Relief would come later, if it came at all. What she felt in that moment was closer to vertigo, the sensation of ground shifting beneath feet that had already been none too steady to begin with. She had spent 3 days preparing herself to be property. She had rehearsed, in the silence of her own mind, the postures of endurance she would need. And now, this stranger stood before her, furious on her behalf before he even knew her given name, and she did not know what to do with a kindness that arrived dressed as anger. "I'm sorry," she heard herself say, though she could not have explained what she was apologizing for. Perhaps only for existing as the inconvenient center of a stranger's outrage. Perhaps for the tears that had finally, after 3 months of dry-eyed endurance, begun sliding down her face without her permission. "Don't," Ezra said, and something in his tone gentled so suddenly it startled her more than the anger had. "Don't you apologize for what was done to you. You've got nothing to be sorry for standing in this yard. Whatever lies got you here. That's not a debt you owe me. That's a wrong that was done to you, and I mean to understand the whole of it before I decide what comes next." He looked past her then toward the empty road where the wagon had already dwindled to a dark speck against the pale grass, and something settled in his expression, some decision arriving and taking root. When he looked back at her, his voice had steadied into something Wren would come to recognize. In the weeks and months ahead, as the particular calm of a man who has decided on a course of action and does not intend to be moved from it by anyone. "You'll come inside," he said. "There's a woman here, Sarah Voss, cooks and keeps the house. She'll see you fed and warm and given a room of your own, a door that locks from the inside, if you want it. Nobody in this house is owed anything from you. Not labor, not gratitude, not anything else a man might think he's entitled to. You understand me?" Wren did not entirely understand. Not yet. Not standing there in the wind with her feet still numb from the wagon ride and her heart still hammering with the aftershock of 3 days spent believing herself sold like a sack of grain. But something in his face made her want to believe him, made her want to set down, just for a moment, the stone she had been carrying since her father's funeral. She nodded, because she did not trust her voice not to break entirely if she tried to speak again. Ezra bent and lifted her trunk himself, though there were hands enough working the ranch that he might have called for help, and something in that small gesture, a wealthy man carrying a stranger's battered trunk across his own yard without being asked, told Wren more about him than any words could have. She followed him toward the house, toward the smoke rising steady from 2 chimneys, toward warmth and food and a locked door that was hers alone, and she did not yet know what would become of her in this valley that stretched wider than any horizon she had known. But she knew, walking behind him through that cutting Montana wind, that whatever Ada Pruitt had believed she was selling for a single dollar, she had been wrong about the man on the other end of that bargain. And Wren understood, with the first fragile stirring of something that was not quite hope, but stood close enough to touch it, that the real story of her life had not ended in her stepmother's parlor with a signature on a careless paper. It had only just begun, here, in the lengthening shadow of a man whose anger on her behalf had felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like being protected instead of owned.